My brother was working on a pipeline, putting natural gas in by Meadow Lake Park, and he was the operator of a big piece of heavy equipment, a Caterpillar. Apparently Colin's machine stalled. He had to stand on the track of the Caterpillar to start a small engine that started the big diesel engine that ran the machine. And when he got out of the operator's seat, there was a gear shift. They called it a Johnson bar. He banged that with his leg when he got out of there and didn't realize that he had knocked the machine into reverse. And when he stood on the track and started the piece of equipment, it started moving. And it tossed him back, and it rolled over, and it killed him. They brought him back to Regina in a body bag.
Saskatchewan has the reputation across the country of being the instigator of Medicare. And just as strongly, but in perhaps a more narrow segment of the population, Saskatchewan is the creator of occupational health. The language that's used across the country, the commonality is our language coming out of Saskatchewan in 1971, 1972. The language that deals with the three fundamental rights are the three rights that Saskatchewan pioneered. So while the overall population knows that Saskatchewan was the birthplace of health in the Medicare sense, Saskatchewan is very much the birthplace of occupational health as well, and its new sweep and its new approach to problems in the workplace.
I think the 1972 legislation was unique in a number of ways. First of all, it provided, you'll remember, the provided for the setting up of occupational health and safety committees in all places of employment with 10 employees or more, with equal numbers of management and union people, workers on each committee. And it provided them with certain very distinctive and very unique rights. It provided them with the opportunity to know, because that was a time when a whole host of new chemicals were emerging on the market, and fungicides and solvents, and carbon monoxide has always been a problem. So the employee's right to know was an important part of the legislation as it emerged, and the right to refuse to do unusually dangerous work. And that, I think, was a key to the success of the program.
If I'm not going to be concerned about my safety or the safety of others, who's going to be?
This was a very exciting period in our lifetime when we got to implement the New Deal for People. And the New Deal was a document prepared by a party program and planning committee. I had the good fortune of chairing that committee. In the health section of the New Deal for People, we committed the New Democratic government to establishing an occupational health and safety service. One part was to come up with a program, but the other more important part really was its implementation. We were really quite fortunate that the Saskatchewan economy had started picking up, and we saw our way clear to start implementing many chunks of the commitments that we promised. We came to a conclusion that it was best to turn over the whole occupational health and safety initiatives to the Department of Labor rather than keep them in the Department of Health.
So it centralized it, and I think made it workable and made eminently good sense as far as working people were concerned. They knew where where they knew where the buck stopped, and that was, I think, a very important move.
I would give credit to Gordon Snyder and Walter Smishik. It was we were very lucky in '71 that Gordon became Minister of Labor and Walter Smishik Health. Both were out of the labor movement. Both were very open and sympathetic towards some reform in this area. Both understood that there was a need more than having the collective bargaining regime define working conditions, hours of work, overtime. But we had to get at noise, dust, toxic substances, pace of work, so that there was no organizational imperialism between these two ministers, which made the centralization very easy.
Yes. Even with bringing all the inspectors together into one group of safety-conscious people, you still didn't have enough people to cover every workplace in the province of Saskatchewan. Not that big a province, but you still couldn't do it. Unless you transferred that power out and gave it into the workplace, it was never going to be sufficient to regulate and inspect from the center.
I think at the time, we had 12 inspectors and 36,000 employers registered by the Workers' Compensation Board.
Yeah. In 1972, our ideas were not nearly as clear, if you'll remember. And really, I think it started with the right to participate, because we wanted to fundamentally move away from the authoritarian model to the inspectorate model, or the professional model, away from the doctors having the power to assess whether or not there was a disease in the workplace and so on, and move the right to participate in that process into the workplace and into workers' hands. What flowed from that was the need for the right to know. Because if you had the right to participate without the right to the knowledge, then you don't have the right at all. And if you recall, the right to refuse actually wasn't part of our initial package. In 1972 it wasn't there, and we wrote it in 1973.
Yeah. I still recall the argument for the right to refuse. The Federation of Labor wanted to strengthen the right to participate. And the way they expressed it was, if the committees simply are consultative, they'll talk to one another till hell freezes over, and there really will not be any changes in the work environment. And they made the analogy to collective bargaining. Without the right to strike,
Yes.
collective bargaining would be an unending debate with no resolution. So there's a need for something like the right to strike to make the committee meaningful. And that's how the right to refuse was rationalized and then later incorporated.
Well, you'll know too that personal experiences influence things later in your life too. And I recall very clearly operating locomotives as a locomotive engineer for CP Rail out of Moose Jaw. And with the wind blowing in the right direction and incomplete combustion in a diesel locomotive, you could work for sometimes a series of hours with a cab full of noxious fumes, and comes a time when it's necessary to make a stand. And I recall on more than one occasion feeling obliged to take the locomotive back to the shop. This right to refuse that we incorporated in the Occupational Health and Safety Act, that was sort of an inspiration as far as I was concerned, because there was no protection for a worker who refused to do what was regarded as unusually dangerous work.
There was quite a process of taking the ideas that had really germinated within the department and taking that out literally on the road. The minister, Gordon Snyder, and the deputy, Don Ching, and I did a road tour, a road show, trying to explain to people the basics of this new act in very early days in 1972. Meeting with chambers of commerce and all kinds of different organizations.
Well, I believe one of the satisfying aspects of the whole program was what emerged a number of months after the act became effective, because we saw a number of instances where accident ratio in a particular industry had been exceptionally high. And with the committee system working and working effectively, accidents were reduced in a remarkable way. And I can recall in one set of circumstances where one of the major employers in the province, in the private sector, was very much opposed to the setting up of the committees and took it upon himself to lay criticism on us for interference in his right to manage. And
I recall that same employer doing a fair bit of lobbying among the MLAs, you know, to either soften or not pass the legislation, but later on became...
Later, after about 14 months of operation, the number of accidents in that industry had gone down significantly, and consequently the contributions, the premiums paid to the Workers' Compensation Board went down in a like way. And at that point in time, this particular employer became one of our best advocates for the committee system.
Committee system works very well because both parties have lots to gain. The employee and their family gain from not suffering through the loss of wages and the pain associated with an injury. And the management gains because they don't have the costs of injuries through insurance and retraining costs. It's a real win-win for both sides. The committee on our side has been a very integral part and in fact has led the way over the last 5 to 7 years in improving our safety record. They have focused on unsafe conditions and made sure that the conditions were taken care of so that workers were not being affected by unsafe conditions. Our company believes that a worker should go home at the end of every work day in the same condition they came to work in, and they should be able to do that for their whole work life. We're very proud of the fact that in 1997 we went for 1 million hours where nobody was hurt seriously enough to have to take time off of work.
It was a process. It was a learning process as well because we had no models, to be honest. And I don't mean just in Canada, but elsewhere. And I think we were open to criticism and tried to deal with some of the criticisms with the 1977 major amendments to the Occupational Health and Safety Act. As a result, it was a totally new act. Mm-hmm. And we gave the regulatory agency enormous powers to regulate areas which we were limited by the 72 legislation.
With all the toxic chemicals in the workplace, I'm worried about having a healthy baby.
One of the evolutions in occupational health, of course, was the evolution of the right to know, which started relatively narrowly. You need to know certain narrow things in order to function effectively as an occupational health committee. And that narrow need to know that leads to the need to know that and the need to know that in order to make a real proper evaluation. Well, if you recall, what we started to bump into was other legal rights. Well, there may be this box of chemicals over in the corner, but I'm not going to tell you what that is because that's going to infringe on my right to manufacture it secretly and have the patent over it. I'm not going to tell you what the fumes are coming out of that bucket of thing in the corner because there's my right to manufacture it in secrecy is called into question. Well, when those two rights collide, something's got to give, and what had to give was the right of manufacturers to that kind of protection. We said you don't have the right to endanger workers in order to make more profit selling a product that you want to keep the ingredients secret. They're working with it, they have the right to know. And it was that sort of peeling back of the layers that led directly to the WHMIS kind of formula that said,
That's right.
there has to be some declaration of what all of these things actually are.
So by the end of the decade, by 81, every province had legislation which dealt with the three rights. So that reform in occupational health and safety was ongoing throughout the decade of the 70s.
Yeah, I now have the privilege of working in the national scene, and it is absolutely clear that right across the country there's a common language. It's built on the same three principles: the right to participate, the right to know, and the right to refuse. Absolutely, you can talk that language in any one of our provinces.
The main hazards that we in Grain Service Union have dealt with in the grain elevators has been grain dust and the hours of work tied to the grain dust. We got grain dust recognized as a problem, and then once workers' comp recognized it, and the grain companies then had to pay a higher premium because of the damage to the lungs. Of course, the next step was to have the law passed that you have to bring down the levels of the dust in the elevator.
And the GSU's experience in Canada clearly showed us that workers have to take on the battle to improve health and safety conditions. And it was because of that experience that we were approached to get involved with a health and safety project in Mozambique. Well, I remember seeing pictures of the first visit that you made, that you brought back, and seeing workers covered almost head to toe in a very fine grain or flour dust. So I mean, if it's covering their bodies, then it's going to be getting into their lungs as well.
When I first went there in '87, they had an idea that it was tuberculosis that they were dealing with. Their lungs, they knew their lungs were being affected by something. The workplace was making them sick, and this was the dust. But they felt it was tuberculosis and
not the grain dust.
And not the grain dust.
The Mozambique project, I guess, to put it in a nutshell, what the project tries to do is, in a workplace, identify workers who would form a shop floor occupational health and safety committee. Those people are trained in how to recognize workplace hazards. They identify those key risk sites. And then they go back and they sit down and they think up solutions.
And you're right, the methodology used there was kind of shop floor, kind of direct training, inspections, the workers themselves working to kind of clean up the workplace. And I think that's the same type of work we did here through Occupational Health and Safety, whether it's federal or provincial, was getting committees set up.
Yeah, well, whether you're in Saskatchewan or whether you're in Mozambique, the worker really needs to have the right to participate in making sure that his or her health is being protected.
The 1972 legislation was groundbreaking in Canada, period. It accomplished more things than people can imagine, because it set a framework for the way occupational health and safety legislation would evolve all through North America.
In 1972, when we got the three rights to know, to participate, and to refuse, that was really important. But what was really missing, we found out through experience, was that if a worker refused to do dangerous work, there was no obligation on the employer to tell someone else that the refusal had taken place. So in fact, we found that there were accidents, many of them involving young workers, and at least one we know of that involved a fatality, where an older worker who knew about the right to refuse had refused, and all the employer did was go to another worker, and in some cases younger workers who didn't know about their rights, and say, okay, you do this job. When we got the amendments in '93, there was an important difference in that the employer now has to tell anybody else that the work has been refused.
I think when we look at occupational health and safety issues that are of direct concern to women and raise the question, are they on the rise? Logic would tell us that of course they're on the rise, because women's participation in the workforce is on the rise. if we look at the new technologies and the new repetitive injury strain, that type of thing, it's women that brought them forward, that identified them for the first time.
As we look at the kinds of jobs that women do, but also the kinds of injuries that they have. We acknowledge that lifting a patient from a gurney back into their hospital bed is very, very stressful on somebody's body and on their back, and that the large number of injuries that there are in the healthcare area and in group homes as well, just by virtue of the kinds of jobs that women do.
Yeah, and comparing unlike things, like for example the studies on stress,
yes.
You know, can talk one hand stressful lifting, but also for many women's jobs, the stress of 10 people asking you to do something at once if you're a clerical person.
I think that it's that, and it is taking a look at it and acknowledging that there's all kinds of workplace hazards that can be there, and that just because you work in an office doesn't mean that automatically it's a safe place to be. And so I think that there is a real difference in how people are looking at work, that it's not fitting into neat boxes anymore, as this is dangerous, this isn't, this is clean, this isn't.
We began to move into areas beyond the narrow traditional occupational health and safety, which were physical dangers and contaminants, to issues of stress, discomfort, social, so that we had a much better way of dealing with the original definition of occupational health and safety: physical, mental, and social well-being.
The argument has been accepted as an occupational health argument that harassment of women in the workplace is a problem in its own right, but it's also an occupational health problem because it makes people ill. It makes the victims of it ill.
I have the right not to be harassed at work.
In 1989, around the time of our fall convention, a situation was brought to our attention regarding 2 women at Dairy Producers Co-op in Saskatoon who were involved in a very, very severe sexual harassment case. And we were asked if we could give these women some time on our agenda. And they came to convention. They presented what had happened to them in their workplace and what had happened to them since. These women did such a good job of not only laying out their case, but laying out their case for everybody else. That this became more of a political issue as well, that this was not one workplace, a couple of women, and someone would solve it. This was a problem that was much broader and much deeper than anybody, I think, was willing to acknowledge up to that point. I think this makes the difference of having a woman deputy minister,
that's right.
too.
Well, you and I were lucky too, and a woman president of the Federation of Labor, because you and I think, put our heads together over coffee for about 10 minutes, and we talked about sort of the general outline, then got the research happening, and got it there and got it in there. Now it's going to evolve.
Yes.
I'm sure it's not perfect. I'm sure there's a lot more that
there's already
we have
complaints
to
that
do.
it doesn't go into personal harassment. When I look at the evolution of health and safety issues from 72 to 93, well, to 97 and beyond, I really think that we need to look at how we take out the whole educational issue to, in particular, young workers. Young people need health and safety information before they ever go into a workplace. You know, we teach kids fire safety when they're little, and we teach them about street safety, and we treat, in some cases in schools, when they get older, they're taught about safe sex, but, how many of them are taught about safe work? There were, on average, 30 to 40 people that are killed on the job every year in Saskatchewan. And what does that mean? It means somebody's not coming home to their families. It means some young person isn't able to fulfill all the dreams that they had for their future. It means all sorts of heartache and hardship. and it's all so preventable.
I'm totally convinced that his death was something that could have been prevented. There was no need for him to die. My son is a construction worker, and I really had a lot of fear, thinking about his safety after that happened to my brother too. It's something that really, really makes you think. So, I guess, if there's any message that I can say to you, don't be afraid to speak up.
This program was made possible with financial assistance from the Saskatchewan Department of Labour, the Communications, Energy and Paperworkers Union, SaskTel, Pan-Canadian Petroleum Limited, Cameco, the Grain Services Union, Weyerhaeuser Canada Limited Saskatchewan Division, and the Saskatchewan Federation of Labour.